Good afternoon. I'm Heather Cousin, Library Services Director for the City of Thousand Oaks. For the Thousand Oaks Reads One City, One Book visit with author Robert Kurson. Robert Kurson is the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers. After getting his start at the Chicago Sun-Times, Mr. Kurson has written for the New York Times Magazine, Rolling Stone, and Esquire. He's also served as a contributing editor at Esquire and won awards for his writing. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you the author of Rocket Men, Mr. Robert Kurson.
I first want to thank the City of Thousand Oaks and the Friends of the Library for bringing me out. This is the biggest honor I could ever imagine, and what a beautiful town you live in. It's very dangerous to bring a person from Chicago out here. My view from the parking garage was better than any view I could get in Chicago in a 300-mile radius, I promise you that. But I want to tell you, before I talk about Apollo 8, which is the subject of Rocket Men, I want to tell you about how I found the story and found the book, because the older I get in life, the more I realize how big a part luck plays in everything, and chance. Sometimes that's a disquieting thought, but it's interesting as well. So this happened about 3.5 years ago. I was showing friends around the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. That's a great museum. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's home to the U-505 U-boat. It's one of only 5 German U-boats left in existence. There are 4 in Europe, and the 5th is in Chicago. It's also a perfect match for the rare Type 9C40 U-boat that I write about in my first book, Shadow Divers. And so when people I know come into Chicago, a lot of them want to see the U-505, and I take them and show them around. And that's what was happening about 3.5 years ago. And I should tell you that one of the primary pleasures of the Museum of Science and Industry is that it's almost impossible to find your way out when it's time to go. It's massive. It's like 16 acres or 19 acres. And we used to go there as kids on field trips every year. I never once found my way out properly. And that was the case 3.5 years ago. When it came time to say goodbye, instead of finding my way to the parking lot, I stumbled into a place called the Henry Crown Space Center. And there in the middle of the Space Center was a spacecraft that looked at once to have come from the past and the future. And it was scarred from its journey. No matter where it had gone, it had been somewhere important. And I went up to it and I read the placard, and it said, "This is the command module of Apollo 8, which made mankind's first journey to the moon." And that stunned me, because I thought I knew a lot about space. I loved astronauts and space growing up, and I thought I knew everything there was to know that was important about space. I certainly knew about Apollo 11, which made the first lunar landing, and I certainly knew about Apollo 13, in which Tom Hanks is Jim Lovell, or Jim Lovell is Tom Hanks. I can never figure out which one it is. But Apollo 8, I'd barely heard of that. But if what I was reading was true, it was saying something really astonishing. It was saying that Apollo 8 represented the first time human beings had ever left home, ever. And the first time we had arrived at a new world, our most ancient companion, the moon. That startled me. How could I not know anything about that? So finally, I did find my way out of the museum. I went home to my home office, and I started to research Apollo 8. And within 15 or 20 minutes, not a minute more than that, I knew that I was not only looking at the single greatest space story of them all, but I was looking at one of the great stories of exploration in human history. It was Homeric in scope. It was an odyssey for our time, the first time humans ever left home and arrived at a new world. So that got me very excited. So what happens to a narrative nonfiction writer when that excitement starts to go? You check Amazon. So surely there had to be 15 or 20 books on this. There had only been one book, and it was almost 30 years old at the time. And that's when a writer's hands start to shake. Now, I always work with living subjects. I find I get the best information from living subjects when I can sit face to face with them and frankly make a big pain in the butt out of myself by not going away. Finally, they kind of turn themselves over to me. So I didn't have much hope, because what's the likelihood of a 3-man Apollo crew being alive almost 50 years later? So I went online and I typed in the name of Apollo 8's commander, Frank Borman. And it said, Frank Borman is a retired astronaut. And if I leave you with only one bit of advice today, it's always better to be is than was. Take my word for it. Then I looked for Bill Anders, who was making his first flight aboard Apollo 8, and it said Bill Anders is a retired astronaut. And then I thought I had it in the bag because Jim Lovell is local. He lives 15 or 20 minutes from me and had a very famous restaurant at the time, and he was Tom Hanks. So I thought if something had happened to him, I would know about it. And sure enough, Jim Lovell is. So I thought I knew someone who might have a phone number for Jim Lovell. I called and got that phone number, left a message, didn't know if it was even the right number. And about an hour later, I got a call back from Jim Lovell. And he said, I know who you are. I read Shadow Divers, and I listened to it on audiobook, and I was late for a meeting at my restaurant one day in the winter. And I got there, and I was in the middle of a chapter, and I knew I was supposed to go in, but I just kept orbiting the parking lot until the chapter came to an end. That remains the best compliment I've ever had. So he agreed to see me, and I went to his restaurant and went in his office upstairs. And it occurred to me after about 5 or 6 minutes of talking to him that I didn't think he realized that I was there to talk about Apollo 8. I think he's so accustomed to everybody asking about Apollo 13 that it took a little while for us to really get on the same page. I said, I don't want to know about Apollo 13. I'm here for Apollo 8, which I believe to be the greatest space story of them all. And he seemed very pleased by that. So that's how the story got underway. He introduced me to Frank Borman, who was living in Billings, Montana, and Borman introduced me to Anders. So that's how the story got underway. So now I'd like to tell you about Apollo 8, which I still believe is the single greatest space story of them all. It began not in 1968, when the rocket made its flight, but in 1961, when President John F. Kennedy made a very bold promise to Congress and the country, actually it was an insane promise. He promised that the United States would land a man on the moon and bring him home safely by the end of the decade. Now, when I talked to Chris Kraft about that, Chris Kraft was the mastermind of mission control. There was no bigger legend in NASA than Chris Kraft. He was 91 when I met him, and when I talked to him about President Kennedy's promise, he said, I want you to note, when I heard Kennedy say that, I fell off my chair, literally. He said, we had no idea in the world how to pull something like that off. Never mind, by the end of the decade, we did not have the science, we did not have the technology, we didn't have the manpower, we didn't know what kind of spacecraft you would use for such a thing. And yet Kennedy promised the country and the world that the United States would do that. Now that wasn't just to get votes or to make a splash in the evening news. It was a matter of existential survival to Kennedy. He believed, as many people believed, that the space race between the United States and Soviet Union was really a matter of survival, that the country that could put a man in space could also put a soldier in space. The country that could land men on the moon could land soldiers on the moon, build military bases. The country, everybody agreed, that could get man to the moon first would be the de facto winner of the space race, which was a big part of the ongoing Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. So Kennedy made that promise when the United States was very far behind in the space race. The Soviets were doing everything first, best, and most spectacularly. The United States needed a way to catch up, and landing a man on the moon and bringing him home safely was the way to do it, but gave us enough time, at least till the end of the decade, to try to catch up from this huge lead that the Soviets had built. Well, Kennedy made that promise. We only fell further and further behind. But by the mid-60s, with the Gemini program, the United States and NASA had caught up to the Soviet Union, and now it was really a sprint to see which side could get the first humans to the moon. It didn't even have to be a moon landing. It just be around the moon. By 1968, it looked like the United States might be able to win that race, and it was coming down to the wire. But in the middle of that year, disasters struck at NASA, and they could hardly have been worse. The first of them was that the lunar module, that spidery landing craft that shuttles 2 of the 3 astronauts down to the lunar surface and brings them back up to the orbiting spacecraft, got plagued with design and production problems and threatened to slow down or even grind to a halt the entire Apollo program and cause NASA to stop working. They needed the lunar module to keep going and keep testing flights up until the actual lunar landing. But maybe even worse, In 1968, the CIA delivered a top-secret memo to NASA officials warning that the Soviet Union was ready to send cosmonauts around the moon as early as late 1968. And that was devastating. So here the Apollo program is grinding down to a halt because the lunar module's not ready, and the Soviets are nothing but ready to go, even by the end of 1968. And this is how things stood at NASA into the summer of 1968, in early August, when a very quiet manager named George Low was vacationing on the beach in the Caribbean. George Low was in charge of the Apollo spacecraft. He had a very important position at NASA. And he was a very unusual guy, very quiet guy. His subjects and verbs always agreed, even when he gave dictation. And he always carried his briefcase with him wherever he went, even to the beach, to suntan, because he never knew when he was going to have one of his great ideas. And in very early August of 1968, he had the greatest idea he would ever have. He rushed back to Houston. He told his secretary, everything from this point forward is absolutely 007, absolute top secret. And he called Chris Kraft into his office. And he made this pitch to Chris Kraft. This was his idea. We cannot send the lunar module, it's not ready. But let's skip not one, but 2 step-up flights and send Apollo 8, which is just scheduled to do a low Earth orbital test flight. Let's send it not into low Earth orbit, 100 miles over the Earth's surface, not even 853 miles above the Earth's surface, which was the world altitude record at the time. He said, let's send Apollo 8 240,000 miles away to the moon. And let's not just do that. Let's do it in 4 months. By the end of the year, let's see if we can beat the Soviets to the moon. Now, this was another occasion when Chris Kraft fell out of his chair. He looked at George Low like George Low was crazy. And to be polite, he reminded Low of why this was absolutely impossible. For one thing, NASA didn't do space flights in 4 months or 6 months or 9 months. It was 12 months to 18 months of preparation, training, working out all the kinks in a space flight plan. 4 months was barely enough time to get a crew together. And by the way, what crew would they use? There was no crew ready for a flight in 4 months. But that was just the start of the problems. They didn't have the technology ready. They didn't have trajectories yet. The software they would need hadn't been written. The simulators that would be required to train a crew for a lunar trip, especially the first lunar trip, weren't even built yet. How could you possibly think of going in 4 months? But even if you could think about it, what about the rocket you needed to get there? The Saturn V rocket was the only machine powerful enough to deliver a crew of humans to the moon. But in 1968, in August, the Saturn V had only flown twice, both times unmanned, the second test flight of which had failed catastrophically. Now, George Low was proposing the 3rd ever flight of the Saturn V to go with 3 men who likely had families and children all the way to the moon. And by the way, as we all gather here in April of 2019, the Saturn V remains, more than 50 years later, the most powerful machine ever built. But it had only flown twice, and now George Low wants to send it to the moon after it had failed catastrophically in its second test flight. And if that wasn't enough, Kraft reminded him that there's no lunar module to bring to the moon. Well, that didn't bother George Low. The idea is to go around the moon, to get there first and to learn everything there was about going to the moon. But that meant they were going to be leaving the lunar module behind. And that potentially spelled catastrophe, because the lunar module served an incredibly foundational backup role as a lifeboat. It was a backup engine. That meant that if the single engine the Apollo 8 spacecraft was carrying when it was orbiting the moon failed, if it misfired, if it didn't fire at all, if it fired too hard or too gently, the astronauts could be stranded in lunar orbit for 10 or 20,000 years before crashing into the lunar surface, or they might crash directly into the lunar surface, or they might be flung off into eternal solar orbit. They had one engine, and it had to work perfectly. NASA was all about redundancy, triple redundancy, quadruple redundancy. Now George Low is proposing to send them with one engine that had to work, and it had to work perfectly, or the 3 men they were going to send were going to never come home. So Chris Kraft is thinking about this, and he thinks this is absolutely insane. But he sees the beauty in George Lowe's plan. If they could somehow pull this off, if they could send Apollo 8 to the moon in 4 months, think of what could happen. The entire program could be kept moving. They might stand an outside chance to beat the Soviets to the moon. And they could do everything, learn everything there was to learn and experience about going to the moon except for the landing itself. And so against every ounce of his instinct and his better judgment, Chris Kraft nodded and he said, George, as long as we're going to do this crazy, crazy thing, let's not just go around the moon like the Soviets are planning to do. Let's go into orbit around the moon. Magnitudes more difficult. Almost impossible to describe how much tougher and more dangerous that was. But Kraft said, if we're going to risk it, let's go for the whole thing. Let's go into orbit around the moon. And George Lowe nodded. And this is a moment in NASA's history that to this day, 50 years later, even the astronauts, and I interviewed so many of them, Apollo astronauts, can hardly believe had happened. When you listen to Neil Armstrong, who was on the backup crew for Apollo 8, talk about that, he can hardly, when you see him on film, he can hardly process that they agreed to this, but agree they did. That they had to get permission from NASA's director, Jim Webb. The next day, managers from NASA called Webb, who was in Vienna, Austria, at a convention. They called him on a secure line. It was absolutely imperative that the Soviets could not listen to this call. And they pitched George Lowe's idea to the head of NASA. He heard them out, and then he screamed at them, "Are you out of your minds?" And he went down the list of risks as we just discussed them. But then he added something else. He said, do you realize, and this is a quote, he said, if something happens to these three men, no one, poets, lovers, no one, will ever look at the moon the same again. They had not thought anything about that. But of course, the same was true of Christmas, because George Lowe's plan called for the astronauts to be in orbit on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1968. Webb asked for a day to think it over. He must have seen what Kraft and Lowe saw. This is a way to win the space race. This is a way to keep the program moving. This is the only chance we have. And so the next day he gave a green light to Apollo 8. Now it was incumbent on NASA to find a crew, and they had to find a crew very quickly. A phone call from Houston was made to Downey, California, where Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were working on their spacecraft. Frank Borman did not want to be annoyed. He had a reputation as the best astronaut, among the best astronauts that NASA had, but he was all business, and he resented getting a phone call while he was inside the spacecraft. But he finally took it. He was ordered to Houston. He protested. They said, get here immediately. He jumped in his jet, and each of these guys has a jet of his own. Can you imagine a funner job than that? And he flew to Houston, and he was walked into a room with Deke Slayton, who was in charge of all the astronauts. And Deke Slayton told him, we have a top secret memo from the CIA. They're going to go to the moon as early as the end of 1968. Frank, do you want to go to the moon? Now, Borman knew all the risks, just as we discussed them, and then some. He knew 4 months, 16 weeks to prepare a space flight, never mind the first journey ever by humans to the moon. Didn't seem realistic or possible. But he had joined NASA for a single purpose. He was not there to explore. He was not there because he was in love with the idea of stars and cosmos. He had no interest in picking up rocks from the lunar surface. He was there for a single purpose and a single purpose only, and that was to defeat the Soviet Union on the most important battlefield there was, outer space. And so without consulting his family, without consulting his crewmates, he said, yes, Deke, let's go to the moon. With that, he jumped back in his jet and he flew back to California. He called his crewmates out and he told them, in 4 months, we're going to go to the moon. And his crewmates had very, very different reactions to this news. Jim Lovell had been in love with space and rockets since he was a high school student in Milwaukee. He'd grown up very poor in Milwaukee. His father had been killed when his dad was a very young guy, and Jim grew up fatherless for most of his life, of his childhood. He and his mom lived in a one-room apartment in Milwaukee, and he warned me that first day when we talked, he said, when you write this, make sure it's not a one-bedroom apartment. It was a one-room apartment. But he fell in love with rockets and the idea of space, but even more than that, with the idea of exploration, of pressing into the cosmos, into the unknown, and arriving somewhere unthinkable before anyone else had been there. So the news that he could be one of the first 3 humans ever to leave Earth and ever to arrive at the moon was overwhelming. He could hardly believe his good luck. Bill Anders reacted very differently to that. Bill Anders had been training as a lunar module pilot, which meant that when his craft was going to go, he was going to be one of the guys to walk on the moon, which he had dreamed of for a very, very long time. But now he knew, because they would not be taking a lunar module, he would have to specialize in the command module. And he knew, and he was right, that people who specialized in the command module did not walk on the moon. And so he told me when I first talked to him, he realized that his chances of walking on the moon had dropped from about 80% to 0. And he was heartbroken. Borman put his arm around him. They walked out to their jets and they flew home to tell their families. So when Frank Borman got home, he called his wife Susan in and he said, "We're going to go to the moon and we're going to go at Christmas." And Susan's eyes lit up and she threw her arms around Frank and she told him how proud she was and how there was nobody better in all the astronaut corps to command the first flight ever to the moon. She knew this was going to be his destiny. It was just the greatest news in the world. And then she went in another room and she tried to kick a hole in the wall. She had been suffering terribly for about 1.5 years since the Apollo 1 disaster had happened. Apollo 1 had been on the launch pad, not for a flight, but just for a communications test, when a fire had broken out in the command module, and 3 astronauts had been killed, including the husband of Susan's best friend, Ed White, had been married to Pat White, and he was killed. And from that point forward, and probably from before that, Susan believed with 100% certainty that Frank was going to die in the line of duty as an astronaut. But now, hearing this news, she was absolutely sure of it. She had also started drinking a little bit when Ed White died and when she saw the devastation it had brought to the White family. A little bit at first, and then more, and then even more. Now, she never showed that to Frank. Susan believed in all her heart that it was her duty, not just to her husband, but to the country, never to bring any anxiety to her husband, that he had enough to worry about at work. And Frank gave me a little book that Susan owned called The Army Wife. And in it, you can see military wives are instructed, like with commandments, do not ever visit troubles on your husband. And she believed it. That was her Bible. And so she did her best never to show Frank that she was suffering, but she was suffering terribly. When Jim Lovell got home, he came in and he said to his wife, Marilyn, "Honey, you know that trip to Acapulco we're planning for Christmas?" And she said, "Oh, no." He said, "Well, I have to go somewhere else." And she said, "But I've already booked the tickets and I have this planned and I have this tour planned. Where could you possibly be going?" And he said, "Would you believe the moon?" Now, Jim and Marilyn were high school sweethearts, so she knew exactly what the moon meant to him, never mind being the first to the moon. So she could not have been more thrilled, and Acapulco could wait, as far as she was concerned. When Bill Anders got home, he told his wife, Valerie, the news. Valerie was very interested in the space program. She also believed in the mission of defeating the Soviets, so she understood immediately just how important this was. But she was also very realistic about the dangers of spaceflight, and she knew where NASA was in the program. So she asked Bill, "What are the chances?" And he knew she wanted a straight answer. She always wanted the truth. And so he thought about it, and he told her exactly what he thought. He said, "I think there's a 1/3 chance of a successful mission. I think there's a 1/3 chance of an unsuccessful mission in which somehow we make it back home. And I think there's a 1/3 chance we never make it home at all." And Valerie told me when she heard that, she breathed a sigh of relief. So this is what these women were dealing with in those days. And I didn't realize it when I started the book, but I realized that soon after talking to the men and the wives, just how heroic and courageous the women were, and just how responsible as the men, I think, for keeping the family together, for giving their husband total clearance, not visiting any anxieties on them, all while the entire world was watching them. All of the families had contracts with Life magazine that allowed the magazine into the home, so nothing was private anymore, and yet the women had to hold up under all this duress, but there would never be duress like the wives of the first 3 who were going to be sent would experience. So now the training had to get underway, and it had to get underway in a hurry. Nothing was ready. The trajectories weren't built, weren't calculated. The software wasn't written. The simulators, which they needed desperately to train in, weren't ready to go. So the astronauts did what they could. NASA did what they could. The people working on the Saturn V rocket worked to fix it as good as they could. And Frank told me that one day he went home and realized that the trajectories hadn't been finalized yet. And he started to calculate the average age of the trajectory specialists who were going to calculate Apollo 8's path to the moon, which is a complicated thing because the moon is hurtling through space at 2,200 miles plus, and everything has to be perfect. And he wrote down the names and the ages, and he came up with the answer of 24 years. The average age of the people calculating 24 years. So this is what was going on with Apollo 8. Finally, the simulators were ready. The guys climbed into it. These are state-of-the-art machines. Every button, every knob, every dial did exactly what it would on the spacecraft when they went. And the instructors started to throw situations at the astronauts. And time after time after time, Borman, Lovell, and Anders died during these simulations. They died over and over and over. And as they said to me, do you know what it means to die several times in one day? But Lovell told me something interesting. He said, after a while, we started to get better, and we would fix a problem here, and we'd fix a problem there. And he said, only by learning to die did we end up learning how to survive. By November, it's getting close. And now it's dawning on the American public just what NASA has planned for Apollo 8. And here come the editorials from the Washington Post, from other major news sources, begging NASA, do not do this. You're rushing. If you kill another crew, that's the end of NASA. And it's not just the journalists who are writing opinion pieces begging NASA not to send Apollo 8 in December. Buzz Aldrin's father, Buzz Aldrin was on the backup crew for Apollo 8. His father sent a letter to NASA saying, do not do this. It's too dangerous. You need fewer yes men there, he warned. Even a high school teacher from Connecticut wrote a letter to NASA saying, this year has been the single worst year any of us has ever lived through, and it's likely the worst year in American history, and he probably was right. 1968 was the year of 15,000 dead in Vietnam. Robert Kennedy assassinated, Martin Luther King assassinated. There's violence on the streets nearly every week, including in my hometown of Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. It seems that every single person is torn against every other. There's echoes from 1968 to today. And this person, this school teacher, is writing and saying, please, this year has been so terrible for all of us, but Christmas is that one day for all of us when we can just forget our differences, exhale, and be human beings for a few hours. Please don't send these men and make this another tragedy at the end of this tragic year. And yet, NASA is committed to go. On December 6th, just 15 days before the scheduled launch of Apollo 8, everybody in mission control and at NASA, and even in the White House, has their eyes on Kazakhstan. That's the launch site for the Soviet space program. And after all this, after all these years, since 1957, when Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, the Soviets are ready to send cosmonauts around the moon 15 days earlier than NASA. It's a tragedy. And all eyes are trained on Kazakhstan, and this is their window. And the morning comes, and nothing happens in Kazakhstan. And hearts are pounding at NASA. And the afternoon comes, nothing yet. And evening comes, and people are biting their fingernails off and pacing back and forth, but nothing happens in Kazakhstan. Now, the Soviets have another day where they can conceivably do this. Once that passes, they're going to have to wait another month because of the position of the moon and the Earth. So everybody's watching. But on December 7th, nothing happens again. And now, for the first time, the runway is clear if somehow NASA could pull off the flight of Apollo 8 to the moon. Very early in the morning on December 21st, the astronauts are awakened about 2:30 in the morning. They eat the traditional breakfast, steak and eggs, and they are suited up. Frank Borman has a helmet that's extra big. It costs $45,000 extra because his head is so wide. He had a nickname of Squarehead. And They connect all their oxygen hoses, and they're carrying oxygen briefcases. And I put this picture in the book because it always struck me funny, that they load them into a van to go to the launch pad, and the van has a big sign that says no smoking, in case any of the astronauts decided to light up then. So they take them out to the pad. It's about 3:30 or 4 in the morning, and the astronauts are taken up 2 elevators nearly 400 feet in the air. The mighty Saturn V is sitting there gleaming in the dark. It is 363 feet tall. Picture a 36-story tall building that they intend to launch off the Earth with the power of a small nuclear bomb. And they go up, and they walk through a gangway, and the technicians wave in Bill Anders first, and he sits in the right-hand seat. And then they wave Frank Borman, the commander, in, and he sits in the left-hand seat. And Jim Lovell was telling me this story, and he said he watched Anders go in, then he watched Borman go in, and he said he looked down through the metal grates that he was standing on, and he could see some dots of light in the distance, and he knew that this was the media arriving, because this was going to be the most covered event in human history, the launch of the first men to the moon. And he could see them arriving for the first time. And he told me, we're sitting at his kitchen table, I'll never forget it, he said, I'm watching the lights arrive, and it only occurred to me then, for the first time, by God, they're serious. They're going to send us to the moon. And I laughed, and he said, the training was so intense and so compressed that nobody had a real chance to even think this thing through. They just had to learn the mission. And only then, seeing this, did it occur to him, we're going. And with that, they waved him in. He took his seat in the center, they closed the hatch, and the countdown started. So I asked the astronauts, what's it like, waiting for the countdown? Because they had a couple hours at least to go. So Bill Anders told me something really unusual. He said, well, you hear some fuel running through things, and you can hear the chatter of the ground crew. He said, but mostly I just went to sleep. I said, went to sleep? You're a couple hours away from man's first trip ever to the moon. He said, yeah, but this was boring. I knew I'd need my energy for the trip itself, so why not sleep now? And then it occurred to me, these guys are wired a little bit differently. And you could not meet 3 nicer, warmer, more genuine guys than Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. They say be careful about meeting your heroes. You could not. They only grew greater in my eyes meeting them for the kindness of their souls. But there is some strand of DNA that's turned a little bit differently that allows a guy to climb on the Saturn V, which has only flown in 2 unmanned tests, failed catastrophically the last time out, and go to sleep. So he said when he woke up, it was almost time to go. And he looked out the window, his right-hand window, and he said, I saw a mud dauber wasp going back and forth across the window, building a nest. Back and forth it went, back and forth it went. And I thought, my friend, you are in for a surprise. The countdown started, and I ask you, everything I tell you from this point forward, you could watch on YouTube and listen to, and some of it is spectacular. And the countdown starts, and it's 10, 9, 8, and the flames start to unfurl at the base of this gigantic machine, still the most powerful machine ever built. And it reaches 0, and this behemoth, 7 million pounds or so, starts to move off the ground. And it's not a second or 2 into the flight that Bill Anders sees Frank Borman take his hand off the abort handle. And when I asked Frank about that, he said something, and I take him very literally because I got to know him really well. He said, I would have rather died than abort by mistake, and he means it. Now, Bill Anders told me a second or 2 into this flight, the violence and terribleness and calamity that's going on in the spacecraft is beyond anything any of them had been prepared for. Nothing they had done in these state-of-the-art, cutting-edge simulators came anywhere close to preparing them for the violence and tumult that was going on in the cabin. It was so violent that Anders couldn't see his instruments. He couldn't hear the launch team. He couldn't see what his crewmates were doing. He had no control over his limbs. And he just thought, well, we're dead. The rocket's fins must be shearing off on the launch tower, and that's it. And then he said, but if I'm thinking that, I'm probably still alive. And about 10 seconds later, just faintly in their earphones, the crew could hear the words, tower clear. And Anders said, I think we're flying. And they were. Now, I knew so little about spaceflight when I started this. I thought the thing just flies to the moon. It doesn't. It loses its first stage in a couple minutes. It loses its second stage, and it ends up in Earth orbit. And they're going to be in Earth orbit for a while to check the spacecraft, make sure it's good, and check everything at mission control is good before they set course for the moon. And that's what they do. And it comes time then for another countdown. And this is a historic countdown, because if this countdown goes correctly, Apollo 8 will gain speed from 17,400 miles an hour approximately to near 25,000 miles an hour. That's the speed they need to escape Earth's gravity and set course for the moon. And that countdown begins. And again, you can watch this on YouTube. It's utterly fascinating and dramatic. And Chris Kraft described this time to me. Standing there in mission control, he said he was watching the green blips go around the Earth. And the countdown starts in 5, 4, and he's shaking, and he can see the people in mission control shaking. This is historic, not just for NASA, but for humankind. They are a few seconds away from setting course away from the Earth for the first time ever. And when the countdown reaches 0, the third stage engine reignites, and the spacecraft begins to pick up speed. Now it's going 18,000 miles an hour, 19,000 miles an hour. And Chris Kraft can see that green blip. Now, instead of circling the Earth, it's headed away. And he is overwhelmed by the moment. He's beside himself. He is desperate to get on the communication system and speak to the astronauts. He has to say something. Human beings are leaving home for the first time, but by his own rules that he wrote, nobody speaks to an astronaut besides another astronaut, called the Capcom. But he cannot hold it in. He has to say something. So he says out loud to himself, to the people in the room, to the whole world, you're on your way now. You're really on your way. And they were on their way to the moon. Now, there's so much I could describe to you in the journey to the moon. I realize I don't have time to do it. One of the many adventures they had, incredible adventures on the way, was that Frank Borman, who had never been sick a day in his life since he started taking flying lessons at age 15, got very, very ill, so badly that NASA came this close to turning the flight of Apollo 8 around. Borman will tell you now, if they tried to turn the flight around, we would have had radio failure. And he means it. They weren't coming back. But it was a very close, scary situation. And it sounds strange to say this, but when Bill Anders described it to me, he used a beauty and a poetry that I never thought was possible to describe the movement of vomit and feces in zero gravity. Trust me, he speaks so beautifully. It was moving. But I'll save that for the book. A couple days later, Apollo 8 is approaching the moon. And they're very, very close now. And they've already experienced so many firsts. Apollo 8 is a flight of almost uncountable firsts, including the fact that they were the first human beings ever to see the Earth as a complete sphere. So now they're closing in on the moon, and Lovell radios into Houston as a point of interest. He says, we've yet to see the moon. And that made sense because they were flying backwards. They could see the Earth receding. Lovell told me it was like looking out the back of your car window when you go through a tunnel and you can see the tunnel entrance before your eyes growing smaller. He said that's what it felt like. But now they're so close to the moon that Lovell can put the entire Earth behind his thumb. But he tells him we've yet to see the moon. And Anders, in the meantime, is looking out his window, and he can see millions of stars. And it seems like millions, more stars than you could ever see on Earth. And he's beholding these stars, and all of a sudden, his window goes black. And it's the worst possible timing, because the spacecraft had problems with oil leaks coming down over the windows. And he said, just at this time, an oil, and then he told me the hair on the back of his neck stood up, because he realized that what he was looking at out the window was not oil, it was the far side of the moon. They had arrived. And again, these are the first 3 humans ever to lay eyes on the far side of the moon, because of course we see only the near side of the moon from Earth at all times. They had arrived. And Borman had warned them, when we get there, I know you guys are going to want to look out the window, but we have a flight plan. That all went out the window. All 3 of them were crowded at the window. Lovell said it was like 3 kids at a candy store window. They couldn't believe it. And also, at the very moment they arrived, the signal with Earth went dead because now the moon is in the way. And they checked their flight plan because the flight plans predicted a time that this would happen, this arrival at the moon would happen. And they looked it up, and they had arrived to the second of the predicted arrival time. Not 1 second earlier and not 1 second later, to the second. Those 24-year-olds got them there. So now Apollo 8 has to get into a circular orbit, and they do that. They get into a circular orbit 69 miles over the surface of the moon. And every revolution, they're there to make 10 orbits, each one about 2 hours. So the plan is for them to be there for 20 hours. And they have lots of work to do. They're going to, among other things, they're going to scout landing locations for the future landing mission. So they're doing all their work. I'll take you to orbit number 4, because they're coming around for orbit number 4. And for the first time, Borman changes the orientation of the spacecraft. So the first time, the astronauts are now flying facing forward. And they're looking out, and they see the vast expanse of the lunar landscape. And it's all gray. There's no color anywhere. There's craters and mountains and hills, but it's eternal gray wherever they look. And then beyond the lunar landscape is the pitch black infinity of outer space. And they describe, all three of them to me, a blackness of outer space different from black that we know here on Earth. It's profound black, and that's all there is in the universe, the gray of the moon and the black infinity of outer space. And they're watching it, and then all of a sudden, just over the lunar horizon, a tiny speck of blue rises up. Blue. And they're staring, and then the blue begins to rise, and it has a curvature to it. And then there's more of it. And suddenly they realize that what they're beholding is the first ever Earthrise witnessed by human beings. It wasn't in their flight plan. No one told them ever to expect it. They never saw it coming. And here, the Earth was rising before their very eyes. And they scramble for their cameras, and they scramble fast. Find that one on YouTube. It's really, really interesting to hear. Now, Borman actually gets off the first shot of the first Earthrise. But he has a short lens, and he has black and white film. But Anders, who's the principal photographer, that's one of his duties on this flight, he has the long lens, and he has color film. And he snaps off some shots, one of which is going to become Earthrise. And I believe that Earthrise, I think you've all seen it, I believe Earthrise remains the single most powerful and important photograph ever taken. It is human beings looking back on themselves for the first time in history. And all three of the astronauts told me that seeing Earthrise changed them forever. And I asked them in great detail over a great amount of time to describe to me those moments. And rather than just try to relay it to you, I'd just like to read you a couple paragraphs from the book, because I got it down, I think, exactly as they explained it to me. The men were due to reestablish contact with Houston in just 1 minute. For now, no one said a word. Earthrise was the most beautiful sight Borman had ever seen, the only color visible in all the cosmos. The planet just hung there, a jewel on black velvet, and it struck him that everything he loved, Susan, the boys, his parents, his friends, his country, was on that tiny sphere, a brilliant blue and white interruption in a never-ending darkness, the only place he or anyone else had to call home. Lovell was overwhelmed by the smallness of Earth, home to 3.5 billion people who, from this vantage point, all wanted the same things: a family to love, food to eat, a roof over their heads, children to kiss. From this distance, he could scarcely comprehend the fragility of Earth's atmosphere, a layer no thicker than the skin on an apple, the only thing that protected those lives and life itself. To Anders, Earth appeared as a Christmas tree ornament, hung radiant blue and swirling white in an endless black night. From here, it was no longer possible to pick out countries or even continents. All a person could see was Earth, and it occurred to Anders in this last week of 1968, this terrible year for America and the world, that once you couldn't see boundaries, you started to see something different. You saw how small the planet is, how close all of us are to one another, how the only thing any of us really has in an otherwise empty universe is each other. As Apollo 8 came around the limb of the moon and readied to reconnect with home, it seemed to Anders so strange. The astronauts had come all this way to discover the moon, and yet here they had discovered the Earth. So that's Earthrise. Anders doesn't know that he has this spectacular picture yet. We wouldn't figure that out until later. But now the astronauts have more work to do. And again, it's all explained in the book, but let me take you to revolution number 9. This is very important because the astronauts are scheduled to make a live TV broadcast that NASA told them would be heard by 1/3 of the world's population, nearly 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people, and would be listened to by more people than had ever tuned into a human voice at once. And with those stakes on the line, they told Borman this: say something appropriate. So Frank has the greatest laugh ever, and I've heard him tell the story a few times, and every time he laughs so great, and he says, can you imagine, in this day and age, with 1/3 of the world's population, them saying, say something appropriate? It would go through 14 committees and 15 focus groups and through the White House, and he said, they just told us say something appropriate and just left it to us. So the astronauts tried to think of something appropriate, and it wasn't coming to them. This was a big thing, and it was going to be broadcast on Christmas Eve of all times. So what would work on Christmas Eve to 1/3 of the world's population for the first 3 humans ever to have arrived at the moon? And Lovell told me they toyed around with changing the words to Christmas carols, but that seemed too silly. They just couldn't come up with it. So finally, time was running short before launch, and Borman went to a friend of his, a sensitive and literary man he knew, and asked him to help. But that man couldn't come up with anything either. He, in turn, gave it to another guy, and that guy was failing. And the launch was coming very close. And that guy was very frustrated one night when his wife walked in the room, saw a bunch of balled up paper on the floor. And she said, what's going on? He confided in what was his task. And she said, well, I know exactly what they should say. And he said, oh, you do? She said, yeah, I do. And she told him. He said, that's exactly what they should say. And that man told Borman, and Borman said, that's exactly right. He told his crewmates. They didn't tell their wives. They didn't tell anyone at NASA at all. They just wrote it down on fireproof paper, put it in the back of the flight plan, and forgot all about it. But now it's Christmas Eve, and the astronauts are making a live broadcast to 1/3 of the world's population. And it's a miracle. You can see this on YouTube too. The screen flickers to life, and there's the moon live 50 years ago. And it's passing under them. And they start saying, this is where we've been. This is what the moon looks like. This is what the moon feels like. There's a crater that we saw. There's a mountain that we saw. And with about 1.5 minutes to go, time is running short because they're going to lose that signal again. And the people in mission control, every single one of them I talked to said their hearts were pounding out of their chests. What are these guys going to say? Grown men, engineers, have their legs shaking. Some of them have to sit down for this moment. And Bill Anders, after the travelogue is over, he says, and now we have a message that we'd like to deliver to you. And everybody's shaking. The wives, their stomachs are in knots. They're all watching. And Bill Anders says, in the beginning, God created. And at that moment, row after row in mission control, people break down sobbing. He's reading from the first lines of from the book of Genesis, the first book in the Bible. And it's a story about all of us. It's how we got here, an origin story. It doesn't talk about tribes or differences. It's about so many of us and who we are and how we got to this place. And Anders reads his few lines, and then Lovell takes over, and he reads his few lines, and Borman finally finishes. And just with a few seconds remaining before the signal goes dead, Borman says, and with that, we want to wish everybody on Earth a Merry Christmas to everyone on the good Earth. And that moment, the signal goes dead, black. And throughout mission control, people are sobbing. At the homes of the astronauts, people are sobbing. But around the world, my research found that people around the world streamed out of their homes, out of taverns, from under bridges, from out of schools, all of them looking upward, hoping to catch a glimpse of this spacecraft and the three men who had spoken to the whole world as one at the end of this most terrible of years, knowing full well that they could never see the spacecraft or the men, but looking all the same. That's what the reading of Genesis meant on Christmas Eve, 1968. The men make one more revolution and it's time to come home. And this is the most dangerous part of the entire flight because they have to relight that single engine. If that engine doesn't light, they're going to be in lunar orbit for 10, 20,000 years before crashing into the surface. Or they're going to, if it lights in the wrong way, too hard, too soft, they can plummet into the moon or be flung off into orbit around the sun. It has to work, and it has to work perfectly. And if it doesn't, there's no way out. And a countdown begins. And it reaches 0. And NASA doesn't know anything. All they know is if it worked, the spacecraft's going to come out at this time, and if it didn't work, it's going to come out too early or too late. And they're watching their clocks. And at the exact moment the spacecraft is supposed to come out, it's nowhere to be found. And they radio, Houston, Apollo 8, no answer. Houston, Apollo 8, no answer. Now 10 seconds have passed, 20. They keep calling and keep calling. There's no answer. Minutes go by. No answer. And as you're reading this, when I'm researching this, I looked at the Apollo 8 spacecraft in Chicago. I almost lost consciousness in worry. What is going on? Minutes have passed. And all of a sudden, over the static, Jim Lovell's voice comes through and he says, "Houston, please be advised there is a Santa Claus." And they've come out of lunar orbit. Turns out that it was just a mistake that Bill Anders had forgotten to switch antennas. So even though they had come out, there's rows and rows of heart attacks in Houston going on. So the trip home is spectacular. It's so interesting. I know I don't have time to describe it. Suffice it to say that there was a mix-up, a mess-up on the way home that almost doomed the flight of Apollo 8. It's fascinating to read about, but would have implications, serious implications, for the survival of Apollo 13. So that alone is a fascinating story. But let me take you to splashdown. The men splash down. Their spacecraft turns upside down, and all kinds of garbage and water rains on their head. And Bill Anders says, here we are, 3 conquering heroes covered in garbage. And they're picked up, and they're put on the ship, and again, because human beings have never flown out of this world before, they have to get all kinds of tests, blood tests, even psychiatrists look them over. And everything looked perfect except for Lovell's habit of letting pens go and thinking they're going to float. Other than that, they're all good. They're greeted, it's hard to describe now just what Apollo 8 meant to the world. They were given ticker tape parades in several United States cities, including in my hometown of Chicago, where more than 1 million people turned out. Time magazine, which had named, when Apollo 8 launched, Time magazine had named the Dissenter as its man of the year, the Dissenter. By the time of splashdown, 6.5 days later, Time magazine had changed its mind to the crew of Apollo 8 as its men of the year. That's an honor that Time magazine didn't even give to Apollo 11, which made the first lunar landing. That tells you what that meant, what Apollo 8 meant. So the guys are inundated with cards and letters and telegrams. Of course, they could only read a few of the many, many thousands that arrived, but one of them stuck out above all the rest. And I'd like to read it to you because all 3 men remember it to this day. Telegrams for the astronauts poured in by the thousands. One, however, stood out from the rest. It came not from a world leader or celebrity or other luminary, but from an anonymous stranger. It had traveled over whites-only lunch counters in the South, through jungles in Vietnam where young men fell, over the coffins of 2 of America's great civil rights leaders. It had blown across streets bloodied by protesters and police, past a segregationist presidential campaign, into radios playing songs of alienation and revolt. It had made its way through 10 million American souls who didn't have enough to eat, alongside generations that no longer trusted each other, into a White House where a no longer loved president slept. It read, "Thanks, you saved 1968." So thank you all so much for coming out here. It's been one of the biggest honors I've ever had. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Kimball. I serve as president at Cal Lutheran, and it's an honor and joy to spend a few minutes in Q&A with Mr. Kurson. That was a fantastic talk. As breathtaking to read and follow as the book, so thank you.
Thank you.
We had a lot of questions, great questions, and because of time, we're not going to get to all of them, no offense intended, and there are a couple that I'm going to kind of merge together a little bit. But I have to say, you are a master storyteller. That is obvious.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if just for a minute you might share, how did you develop that gift? Where did that come from?
Well, I grew up in a family. My dad owned a motorcycle paints and lubricants manufacturing business, and he was its primary traveling salesman. So he was on the road 9 or 10 months out of the year. And in order that I didn't grow up feeling fatherless, he and my mom agreed that I should accompany him on his business trips, which would often take me out of school for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Can you imagine a better dad to have than that? They won't allow that these days, by the way. But he was the best storyteller in the world. And what we did during most of these trips was tell stories. And the only rule was that if he told a story, I had to tell him a story. And when you listen to a great storyteller like that, it kind of seeps in to your bones. So I didn't ever take a writing class or keep journals or do all the things that most writers are supposed to do growing up. But I listened to one of the great storytellers driving endless hours across this great country. And I think that's had something to do with it.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think we owe his dad a great thank you, too. You mentioned early on in your talk that you deal with living subjects.
Yes.
So in this case, just the 3 astronauts in particular, all alive, that attracted you. But that means you have to enter into a relationship with them. Could you say a little bit about the relationship with each of the 3? And then there are a couple of follow-up questions to that.
Sure. Well, it was a big advantage to me that Jim Lovell had read my book. That was the single luckiest thing that happened to me here. And also that he only lives 15 minutes from me. So that was a good combination. After he and I had a connection and he saw I was serious and I had done my homework on the thing, he called Frank Borman and vouched for me, so to speak. And then Borman vouched for me to Bill Anders. But one of the funny things was the first time I went to visit Frank in Billings, Montana, we went to dinner. And when he dropped me off at my hotel that night, he said, you know, if you weren't everything Jim said you were, I was going to send you home. And he means it. So I was lucky to connect with them, and that's important. And then they were very, very generous with their time. All 3 of them allowed me to come out and gave me everything I needed for all 3 years that I worked on the book.
And have they responded once the book has come out? Have they said anything? Have you had a chance to talk about it with them?
Yes, very much so. In fact, I sent each of them my manuscript before it was published, and I told them I'm not looking for editorial input, but I want to fact check this book. I want to make sure it's bulletproof. And so they had all read it by the time it came out, and I think all 3 of them really loved it because the 2 days after it was published last year, all 3 of them came to the Museum of Science and Industry and helped me launch the book. And I have a video of that on my website, it's just robertkurson.com, but it's wonderful to see how sharp and brilliant and funny they are and the camaraderie they have 50 years later. I think I'm on stage with them for 45 or 50 minutes, but you can just pick any 5-minute slice out, and it's amazing to see what phenomenal guys these are.
That's fascinating because I think many authors hesitate to send something in advance thinking that the subject or subjects may want to edit and limit that. But you felt comfortable taking that risk and they honored?
Yeah, they absolutely honored it. And I warned them that if, I might say something about you're not happy with, that's not what I'm looking to change. But if I say, something stupid about the Saturn V that wasn't the case, you have to save me. So that worked out perfectly with them. In previous books, I've given the same warning and had subjects come back and say, oh, this is a great book, but you know that part where you say I behaved very badly with my neighbor? You got to take that out. And I said, no, if I take that out, then you look like a cartoon. You're all good. You're human. And that's what makes the story really interesting. And I've always, in the end, had them see it that way.
I think one of the things that interests members of the audience in a sort of general way is a comparison of 1968 in the context of the space program there with where we are today. Before jumping into that directly, I'd ask, did any of the three, and maybe I'm thinking Frank Borman in particular, have views on what is happening or not happening in terms of space exploration in the U.S. in our own time?
Yes, I've heard them asked about that, including at the end of this event we did together in Chicago. And every time I've heard them ask, they seem very excited about private enterprise pushing into space. But I think all three of them, from what I can remember, are more careful about predictions for Mars than many people are. I think they think that's farther off and a little less realistic than some enthusiasts think today. However, they're all for the return to the moon, and the sooner the better.
And they're okay, at least, with it being private, perhaps, rather than government funded, or at least open to that
Yeah, I think
possibility?
whoever can make it happen, I think it's good by them.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, and I have to make a confessional moment to the audience here, I'm a historian by training, doing relatively recent U.S. history, so the anchoring of this story in 1968, which some of us remember, you were too young, but I wasn't, as this tumultuous time, not only in the U.S., but as you say, globally, and yet this miraculous voyage of discovery happens and comes together. Were they, the astronauts, aware of that broader context much, or were they so into the incredible detail and everything that went into the flight itself?
I think it was very much the latter. I mean, they all were aware that things were happening, but the training was so intense, especially starting in August when they got this assignment, that it was very difficult for them to be aware of much anything. In fact, I think Bill Anders told me that he had so little time for family even then, that he calculated that he averaged 11 minutes a week per child attention, and that's all he could do even for his family. So the idea that they could be steeped in current events then would have been unrealistic, I think.
Yeah, and speaking of family, that was one of the things you mentioned it today, the important role and burdensome role that was placed on women. You just mentioned family. That comes through in the book. Was that something that they were comfortable with? They didn't push back with you when you shared the manuscript with them?
No, very much so. I think they appreciated recognition of the women. I'm embarrassed to say that that wasn't on my mind when I started. I was so taken with the idea of the space flight itself, but it became very apparent very quickly just how grateful these men were for the contributions of their wives. And when you learned what the women went through and the worry, and it wasn't just as when the men were astronauts. These women were the wives of test pilots and fighter pilots who were in the military. And it was a regular occurrence for these women to hear their husbands say, I'm going out flying with 3 other guys today, hear an explosion in the sky a few hours later, run outside, see a black cloud in the sky, and only 3 parachutes coming down instead of 4. And then they would have to go in and sit on their couch and pray that the black car that drove down the driveway wasn't going to pull into their driveway and was going to go to somebody else's house. And this is something they lived through regularly. So that by the time they got to NASA, it was already very, very difficult on them. But now they have to deal with not just going to the moon, but their husband being one of the first 3 ever to go to the moon and under such duress. And yet they don't show it at all to the country. As far as the country's concerned, these are perfectly happy families with not a worry in the world.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, the way you humanize them and their experience and their family's experience. Certainly, for me, speaking as one reader, that really resonated because, frankly, it was something I hadn't really considered before, just like I also hadn't considered the implications of Borman's illness on the flight, and the descriptions there will stick with me for quite some time. The question that occurred to me in reading the book, and it goes to the nature of the 3 astronauts, is you had Borman, the staunch Cold Warrior, anti-Soviet person, yes. Anders, the scientist, almost kind of geeky, and then Lovell, the pilot, good guy, great American success story, the kind of person to be played by Tom Hanks.
Yes.
Oh. Wait, I guess he was played by Tom Hanks. Was there a complementarity of their personalities that made it work in the event, or is that kind of a structure in your narrative to move things along?
No,
or both?
It really was, and it seemed so unlikely because Borman and Lovell had flown before on Gemini 7. And that was a 14-day flight in a capsule much smaller than the Apollo command module, really the size no larger than the front half of a Volkswagen Beetle, for 14 days. It was a medical mission, really partly to see how long humans could possibly survive a space mission. And so they put these guys who appeared absolutely polar opposites, as you describe, in this tiny little capsule. And some people were expecting absolute disaster. How could someone as serious and no-nonsense as Borman sit beside someone as carefree and lovable as Lovell for 14 days and you can't move? Well, it turns out they loved each other on this flight. They're singing together, they're sharing a toothbrush, they're joking. And when they finally splash down and the ship plucks them out, Lovell says, the first thing he says is, "I'd like to announce our engagement." and no one loved that joke more than Frank. So these guys somehow are paired together perfectly. And then they bring in Anders, who's 5 years younger than they are. And Anders is somehow this combination of Borman. He's seen as kind of a junior Frank Borman in his seriousness and his Cold Warriorness. But he also has this scientific instinct and this real appetite to explore outer space. So he's kind of this beautiful combination of the two senior astronauts, and they just fit together perfectly. NASA somehow knew exactly what they were doing.
And as I think about what happened, many things happened after Lovell almost becoming something of a media celebrity himself, Borman successful in business and a visible spokesperson for the airlines when he ran it. Did they stay in touch with each other? Did they always have a special bond as a result of this experience?
Yes, I think they did. And even when you see them together now, you can tell that these are guys who have loved each other for 50 years. And they have a love of airplanes also. One of the luckiest things that ever happened to me is I got to fly with Borman in his airplane and with Anders in his airplane. And they're still magnificent pilots. It was one of the great thrills of my life.
Wow.
But they share this love of airplanes, and they love each other. There's no question about it. And again, you can see it in any 5-minute snippet of that video. 50 years later, they can finish each other's sentences. They can joke with each other, tease each other, and they understand each other.
That's neat. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and kind of take you out of maybe your comfort zone, perhaps, and think a little bit, or ask you to speculate a little bit on where we are today. And we've talked about their interest in at least getting to the moon. Mars may be less viable. But just a couple of months ago, the Chinese were the first to actually land a spacecraft on the dark side of the moon to relatively little attention in the U.S. And you think about the context that you described so well, that this voyage of '68 was driven by Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, particularly for Borman, but from John F. Kennedy on down. Yet today, I think you make the argument that the contest for world influence is going to be with China, and here they are taking a pretty dramatic step. Do you see that there is going to be some kind of resurgence in space exploration as part of an international, if not Cold War, competition with China the way we had 50 years ago?
I think there absolutely will be. And by the way, Israel has the first private spacecraft in orbit around the moon as we speak, and is going to land it soon. And so it's not just China, it's a race for the moon. And people laughed a lot when President Trump announced the formation of a space force. But this really goes back to the beginning of the Cold War and the space race, and the thinking that ultimately the ultimate battlefield is outer space. In 1957, when the Soviets put Sputnik into orbit around the Earth for a few days, this was the most exciting, greatest, thrilling thing in the United States. This was the first, man had made his own moon. And the Soviets could tell you exactly where it was. You could see it with binoculars, and you could tune in its beeps on radio. So this seemed miraculous until it dawned on the public that if you could put satellite in space, you could drop a bomb from any point in that orbit at any point on Earth. And people realized very quickly that space will be the ultimate battlefield. And I think that's a very serious thing that people have to consider. And I do think that increased military push will occur in space very soon.
And you think that, even though perhaps this is just me, but in sort of looking at the media, that technology and science areas of competition are around artificial intelligence, computer hacking, and so forth, that's being posed rightly as a competitive element. But you still see space as essential because of that military reality. If you control the skies, if you will, you have a military advantage.
Right, and it even goes beyond the military in terms of where could we go if life on Earth is imperiled. And that's the thinking of a lot of people also, that you have to build outposts, and there's no place to build them other than outer space.
Yeah. And again, asking you to speculate, I think many of us appreciated their story as an antidote, counterweight to just the grim reality of 1968, a terrible year across the world. Do you see that space exploration could be a savior for our own time when we see many of these things, from protests in the streets in France? Of course, you always see protests in the streets in France, but that's another story. To populist movements, et cetera. Is there still that opportunity for something like that again to bring us together?
I think there is. Vice President Pence, last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, announced that the United States should land men on the moon within 5 years. And I think if that happened, you would see a repeat of that kind of feeling of togetherness. It's hard for me to imagine, as divided as we all are now, that very many people would protest the beauty and miracle of that happening again, especially with the high-definition film they all send back and everything. And if it's done in the right way, in a spirit of togetherness, bipartisan, nonpartisan, I think it can be to have that similar effect. But it will only, one of the special things about Apollo 8 is that no matter what technology we develop, no matter how advanced we ever get in civilization, we will have only left Earth for the first time once, and that was Apollo 8.
Yeah, and that's the story that you have told so well. One of the questions submitted, actually it wasn't a question, it was 3 words followed by 3 exclamation points: greatest story ever.
I agree.
And I think, yes, indeed.
Well, I just felt extremely lucky to find it when I found it. When I found it, books usually take me 3 years, start to finish, and I found it in 2015. I'm not great at math, but even I could see that I was going to get finished with this on the 50th anniversary, and it was going to happen at Christmas. And to meet these 3 guys and have them be so helpful and so kind and generous, and their families and everything, was just very, very lucky for me. I started to think, am I crazy thinking this is one of the greatest stories ever? And I had 3 exclamation points every time I thought about it. But then I started to watch interviews with other astronauts, and one after the other said, there's everything else, and then there's Apollo 8. Even Neil Armstrong said, when we went, everything we needed to do had been proved doable, separate from the landing itself. But when Apollo 8 went, nobody knew that any of it could be done. So to me, that makes it one of the great stories ever.
And I think everybody in this room would agree with that. Let's thank Mr. Kurson for being here.
Well,
and for
thank you all again
book.
so much.
And I want to thank all of you for being here this afternoon and assure you that he is willing to answer any questions you have. We know you have many of them, and can meet down in the lobby where he'll also be signing copies of the book. So thank you all for a wonderful afternoon. Hope to see you down in the lobby with more quick Q&A. Thank you.